Hey, Trevor here. I'm back with another video, and my videos have been lacking because I'd rather race cars than make videos about cars. That being said, there are some update videos that are coming of the rear motor B5.6 that I built, which was a B5 chassis and a bunch of B6 parts. So I'll talk about my racing season with that car. Also, I'll do a update video of my Pro SC.6, which is a Pro SC10 with a bunch of SC6.1 parts on it. And then finally, the T5.6 project that I worked on, which was a rear motor stadium truck that I tried to build using a B5 chassis, Pro SC10 parts, and SC 6.1 parts. That one was an abysmal failure, and so I hope you're looking forward to hearing about that and possibly saying, I told you so. But no one told me so. Turns out that stadium trucks are built using longer than buggy chassis for a reason. But anyway, we're already a minute in and haven't spoken about these cars yet. So this video is a comparison and contrast between the B6.2 two-wheel drive carpet car and the new B6.3 two-wheel drive carpet car. So we're going to do a comparison and contrast. We're going to talk about how they're the same and how they're different, and more importantly, I'm going to point out a huge important thing. Okay, maybe it's not huge, maybe it's not important, it's probably not even an epiphany, but something that occurred to me the other day, that if it would have occurred to me sooner, this would not be a thing. This B6.2 would not have been built. All right, so just a quick little backstory. Started into racing last year in the spring. Last winter, the winter of 2021, was my first indoor carpet season. I built a dedicated B6.2 carpet car for that season. Then the B6.3 came out, and I thought, B6.3 for our dirt tracks, probably not a good idea. Bought one anyway, and I was right. But a B6.3 for carpet might be cool, so why don't I get one and try it out? So, after testing the B6.3D on our dirt tracks and struggling, frankly, except for one track that has gobs of grip where I was actually able to run it with a layback transmission, I thought, I'm a little worried about how this B6.3 is going to perform. So why don't I go into my parts and, well, actually what happened is I had this B6.2 and I upgraded it to a B6.3. So when we do the comparison and contrast here and I stop rambling, you'll understand what parts I purchased to make a B6.2 into an updated B6.3. So that's what I did. I upgraded my B6.2 to a B6.3, and it wasn't too expensive. I've built parts cars before and spent way too much on them, to the point where it's like, wow, I could have just bought a new car, or I could have bought a complete car online used for less than I spent. And anyway, so after I had this built, then I started to worry about how it would perform on carpet, and I wanted to actually compare the B6.2 straight up against the B6.3. So what I did was went through the parts and built another B6.2 out of some spare parts, ordered a couple of parts I needed, and then I set them up identically. So the setup that I had at the end of the season of my B6.2 with regards to the shock package, what springs I used, what the amount of stroke I used, the oil I use, the sway bars that I use, the pills and their locations, the setup, not the servos or speed control, the setup, how I adjusted the car, the axle heights, all of that I put on my 0.3. So the plan was hit the track with a 0.2 and a 0.3 with identical setup. Yes, the electronics are also identical, and see how they compare. But then I was like, well, it's not a B6.2, so maybe it's not going to drive well with a B6.2 setup. And the goal here was, once I had identical setups on cars, the only difference between the two would be the biggest new feature of the 0.3, and that is the wider C and D blocks to give it a wider pivot point. So why don't we start there when we do our comparison. The B6.2 uses a narrower C and D block than the new 0.3, 1 millimeter, and it uses 75 millimeter rear arms with a 69 millimeter dog bone. Compare that to the dirt car, same C and D block, 69 millimeter arm, or dog bone, sorry, and 73 millimeter arm. The B6.3 has gone to a 73 millimeter arm and a 69 millimeter dog bone on both the 3 and the 3D, so the dirt version as well. Okay, so that's the biggest difference. Normally I would start at the back and work my way to the front, but I'm dyslexic, so we're going to do it this way. All right, biggest difference is the width of the D blocks. So on the 0.3, they made the D blocks wider, and they say all kinds of wonderful things as to why they did that. Make the handling more predictable, more stable. It takes away grip, and so it's better for a high grip surface. Okay, next, we've got new plastic for the wing mount, and there's a hole through the wing mount, and that hole is for a cross brace. Where are you? Right there, you can see that little hole. There's a cross brace goes through there if you want to stiffen it even more. The B6.2 uses probably the original B6 wing mount. You see there's no hole, and the plastic is different and it's more flexible. The next difference is the shock tower. So the shock tower on the B6.3 now has 4 holes at the top for the shocks, and it's considered wide. The B6.2, only 3 holes at the top. Now, those of you that are very attention to detail oriented may have seen that on my 0.2 here, I've actually used 0.3 shock tower guards, and that's because it's on carpet, and there's a good chance that those will tear your carpet. So I've added those to my 0.2. So, but on the 0.3, that is something else. They come up with a whole new parts tray. And this is it here with a few things cut off. A whole new parts tray made of different plastic. That's where you find your shock tower guards and your new steering linkage. We'll get to that in a bit. All right, what else is new in the back? C&D blocks. New plastic for the wing mount, and new rear tower with an extra set of holes. It's wider, and you have the new shock tower protectors on there. And I just noticed one of mine is kind of not quite in place. All right, let's take the body off. The next major difference between the two cars is the slipper. So the slipper on the B6.2 uses there's a variety of spur gears that will fit this slipper system. But if you come over here and look at the spring and the nut, it is from the 0.1, the B6.1, and it's a bit smaller, uses an M3 nut. The B6.3 and the B6.3D use the new Octolock slipper. And so that gives you a spur gear and slipper pad with 8 points of contact to make sure that slipper stays locked in there. Also, there's a difference in how much slipper pad material there is between the B74.1 and the B6.3D. So all the carpet cars are set up with the larger pad with the more material from the B74.1. And on this side, we also have the B74.1, like 500 inch-pounds of pressure spring. And that is because you need less slippage on the carpet, I guess. So that's also new. Okay, chassis is new. right off of the bat, the complete chassis is new between the 0.2 and the 0.3. And along with the new chassis comes new side rails. Now, the reason why they did that, if you look at the 0.2, you'll see here that it uses the same servo mounts that screw in directly into the side rail, and they've been doing that, I think, all the way to the original B6. I don't think I know. So the servo mounting system has not changed since the B6. Not the best, because if you strip out either one of those screws, you're scrapping a whole side rail. So that's no bueno. The new chassis has some extra holes on the bottom. These holes, which you'll see on the 0.2, are not there. These are for attaching the servo weight under the servo. But you see on the 0.3, 2 extra holes. And those 2 extra holes are there to accommodate the new servo mount. So let's get a closer look at that. You can see here across the top, there's a new servo mount. Excuse me. And that this is the factory team aftermarket one with the carbon. The one that comes in the kit is plastic, but there's aluminum mounts now. You screw your servo to the aluminum mount, and then you screw the mounts to the chassis. How novel. That's how everybody else has been doing it forever. Next, up front, new ball stud mount and top plate to improve the steering. The piece that holds the bell cranks onto the ball stud mount has a little peg now, and that little peg, that little post, locks into your top plate, and that stiffens up and takes some of the slop out of the steering. Next, the steering linkage material that goes between the servo horn and the bell cranks, that is now made out of the same new plastic that the shock tower guards and the new ball cups, not ball cups rather, but the new shock eyelets are made out of. That was another new thing that you got with the 0.3 is some new longer shock eyelets. Next, up front, we have a new gull shock tower. It still only has 3 holes like the other one, but they've changed some of the geometry. Associated has on their website an overlay of the new shock tower on top of the old shock tower, or vice versa, and you can kind of see they like a silhouette of one over the other, so you can see the subtle differences. But the big thing about this new tower is also the new guard. So this new guard, huge improvement over the old guard as far as durability and keeping dirt out of it. As far as moving your shocks, it's a bit of a pain in the butt. So this is the B6.1 shock tower guard, and as you can see, it's all open in the front here, and you can access your screws. Fine on carpet, but on dirt, especially if you're racing on like loamy, loose dirt, and you drive like I do, you roll over a lot, these all get packed full of mud and dirt and stuff, and you got to keep that clean. With the new shock protector, those shock screws are completely covered over. So to get to them, you got to remove these 2 screws, and they go right through the shock tower into this plastic part in the back, and that's how they're threaded in. And the rest is the same as always. There's been no other significant changes. New chassis, new servo mounting system. They've increased or they've taken some of the slop out of the steering by improving the plastics and supporting the steering system. New slipper, shock towers. I'm repeating myself. So that means we're done then. So those are the major differences between the B6.2 and the B6.3. Again, the most significant difference is the width of the C and D blocks. Had I known the next thing I'm going to share with you, I would not have bothered to rebuild a B6.2 so I could compare them. It's still going to be interesting. I'm going to hit the track with a B6.2 and a B6.3, set up identical. Maybe not the best setup for the 0.3 given the change in rear end geometry, let's talk about that. I'm all over the place. All right, because the rear pivot point width is now wider, the C block and D block are wider. If you look at where the ball studs are on my B6.3, even though this is a carpet setup, they're still in the middle. Now, we used to run the ball studs in the middle for dirt. Well, we still do, depending on what car you run. But anyway, you see here on my B6.2 carpet car, I've got the ball studs all the way in to get the rear camber lengths long for that carpet type setup. To get the same effect on the 0.3, you actually run your ball studs all the way in. And I was on dirt, I was running them in the outside hole to get the same effect that you would get on a 0.2 in the middle hole. And some guys who know a lot more than me were like, no. They explained to me why it was wrong. I smiled and nodded, pretended to understand, and just went with what they said because I didn't have time to get it beat into my brain. And this guy knew what he was talking about. So I was like, if he says just do it, then we're just going to do it. So we did it. And sure enough, the car was wonderful. Where the ball stud is on the hub, there's a spacer there. And it was 1 millimeter on the dirt, 2 millimeter on the carpet. And he was like, no, you got to make that 2 millimeters and then bring the ball stud out. And anyway, it worked out great. Not done testing that car. That car is for another video because it's a 0.3 Frankenstein. It's got a 0.1 rear end. It's got a 4-gear stand up. It's crazy. Anyway, so back to this. Okay, Jeebus. The B6.2 C and D blocks fit on the 0.3. So if I wanted to compare the handling of a 0.2 to a 0.3, I didn't need to build a whole new car. I just need to be smart enough to realize that the C and D blocks in the 0.2 fit on the 0.3. So if you like the front end of a 0.3 and the improved steering pieces, the new servo mount, you like all that stuff, right? But you're not really comfortable with the rear geometry of a 0.3, no problem. Take off those C blocks, put the 0.2 C blocks on, and then you're back to the geometry of a 0.2 on your new 0.3. So if I had known that, I probably wouldn't have built a 0.2, and I just could have tried it on the track with my B6.2 setup with the wider 0.3 C and D blocks, and if I didn't like it, then I could put the 0.2 C and D blocks on and go back out and see, and then adjust accordingly. But instead I built a whole new car, which is cool. So I'll show up to the track with 2 cars, and I'll run them each on the clock for 5 minutes and see which one's better. And if the 0.2 is better, well, then I'm going to take the C and D blocks from a 0.2 and put them on the 0.3, and then continue to work on my setup from there. So I hope that was somewhat useful. I'm sure it wasn't completely useful, and I'm sure it wasn't completely awful, and maybe even a little bit entertaining. So thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned for more videos on some update videos on the other projects that I worked on this summer, and talk about what's coming next. Until next one. Bye, everybody.